Inspired by the recent LIGO discoveries, and what's shown here are the jets of two neutron stars that have just merged. I want to tell you today about the powerful and particular aspect of Caltech's success. That is Caltech's instrument makers. The quest to find new ways to interrogate nature has been an historical strength and characteristic of Caltech from its very founding days, and also speaks to the power of philanthropy. I will be telling you a number of stories today that go back to that beginning of Caltech, but necessarily I want to be prospective as well as retrospective, and to emphasize that this quest to interrogate nature continues to this very day and must be nurtured if Caltech is to remain successful. So let me talk about those elements of keeping Caltech special. It's very easy in concept, somewhat harder to implement. That is, you need to attract the most innovative and creative people. You need to create a culture where they want to ask questions that other people are not asking. And often that is through developing transformative instrumentation. And then you need to provide the unfettered resources that permit them to succeed in this quest. Caltech faculty are known for tackling complex problems that others don't approach. And often the means to do that is to invent instruments that illuminate the universe, creating knowledge for the long term, and also solve problems that affect people's lives today. Culturally, we like to think of this as the limitations on asking these questions, on answering these questions, comes from failures of imagination. If you think of LIGO, when it started, they were 10 orders of magnitude away from being able to measure any system. Yet, that didn't daunt them. We continued because we could see a way to proceed forward. This, of course, is contingent on accommodating risk. You have to be willing to fail to be able to succeed at this highest level. And that is where, of course, the philanthropic part of this comes in terms of seeding these types of efforts. And this, as I've mentioned, of course, is embedded deeply in Caltech's history. And you can see from one of our founders, Robert Millikan, the notion that Caltech was founded for the intimate contact between the leaders in the fields of pure and applied science, asking those fundamental questions, developing the approaches and the engineering capabilities to answer them. Let's start with astronomy and optical telescopes, which may be the most famous example. So this is a drawing of the original 100-inch reflecting telescope at Mount Wilson, the Hooker telescope. This was built by George Ellery Hale. George Ellery Hale actually built 4 telescopes, each of which was the largest telescope in the world when it was built. There was only one company in the world, the French plate glass company, that was willing to cast this 100-inch mirror. It was made from 9,000 pounds of wine glass, actually, and came out actually pretty irregular, with a number of different crystallites and imperfections, bubbles. They tried again, this was just before World War I, developing a new furnace to try to melt the glass more evenly, but it turned out that they weren't successful and World War I got in the way. So Hale decided that what they would do is go back to the original blank glass and try to grind it and polish it to the appropriate size. So they did this, they built a new grinding machine. It took 5 years to grind in this fashion. It had to be smooth and regular in terms of the proper shape to a millionth of an inch, and brought it over to the US, lugged it up Mount Wilson, installed it in the dome, and then the first time they looked through it, they pointed at Jupiter, they found 6 or 7 irregularly shaped images all on top of each other in the eyepiece. So you can imagine the reaction. Well, it turned out that the dome had been open for the installation of the mirror, and so the mirror had warped under the heat. So they shut the dome, came back the next night at 3 a.m., so you can just imagine being there, looked through, and in fact had beautiful images. And in fact, this instrument was the largest optical telescope in the world for 30 years. It determined that the Milky Way was not the only galaxy in the universe. There were many more galaxies outside of the Milky Way. It showed that the universe was expanding, and in fact, determined the first indications of dark matter. Today, of course, we have even bigger telescopes. They look somewhat different, but it's the same concept and the same motivation. The British poet Alfred Noyes was on top of Mount Wilson and inspired him to write a poem where he wrote, "The explorers of the sky, the pioneers of science, now made ready to attack that darkness once again." And we continue to attack that darkness. This is a drawing of the 30-meter telescope, which we're trying to build in Hawaii. It's similar in design to the Keck telescopes, which are 10 meters. Now we, instead of having one piece of glass, have segmented mirrors that are adjusted precisely to mimic a much larger parabola. We have adaptive optics shooting lasers into the atmosphere to create artificial stars to be able to figure out what the turbulence in the atmosphere is to correct it. So it's like flying in space in that way. We have lots of different spectrographs, coronagraphs now to try to look for life on other planets circling other suns. But it is not only optical astronomy. Of course, we are now in the age of gravitational wave astronomy. And this is a picture of LIGO, the Gravitational Wave Observatory. There are two of them in the US, one in Hanford, Washington, one in Louisiana. This is the one in Louisiana. You can see there are two 4-kilometer arms which form the interferometer, the eye in LIGO, that lets you detect the oscillations in space-time when there are large gravitational events like mergers of black holes or mergers of neutron stars. This is an incredible engineering success. Of course, the science is remarkable, but the instrument that had to be made to see this, you have the distortions in space-time continuum that are far less than the size of an atomic nucleus. And yet you have to detect this in the vibrating Earth, people and cars walking by, driving by. So you need incredible isolation of the instrument. You need, in fact, to have mirrors that are perfectly spherical, at least to 1/100th of a millionth of an inch, around large objects that basically are hanging from silica threads that are as thick as your hair. These, in fact, are so good that they turn out to be large quantum objects themselves. You have to form a vacuum here, and it takes something like 40 days to pump this out. Something like the air that would fill 250 million footballs comes out of these tubes. You have lasers that are megawatts, the power that could light 1,000 homes. All these put together in an incredibly precise instrument to be able to interrogate the most violent events in the universe, these mergers of black holes, which we would have no idea out there except for the gravitational waves. Kip Thorne captures it. We're inexorably drawn toward the future. And we are, and that future in astronomy is multi-messenger astronomy. That is, we are seeing events now with the mergers of neutron stars and what will be, I am sure, mergers of neutron stars and black holes and stellar explosions, where the signatures are not only gravitational waves, but they're also electromagnetic waves. There are only two types of waves that go across the universe: electromagnetic, that is X-rays, light, radio waves, and gravitational waves. And we are now in the position, through LIGO and through running the largest optical telescopes in the world, as Caltech, to provide leadership in interrogating these incredible events and understanding how our universe is configured. And we will be able to look at more and more of this universe. So this is a conception here of where we are in terms of the sensitivity of LIGO. This is advanced LIGO, where we saw our first events. As we look to the future, we expect, in fact, to increase the volume immensely, which means that we will start picking up events every few weeks, maybe every few days. So we will really be able to do astronomy and then coordinate the optical measurements with that. Seismology is another area where Caltech has been there from the beginning. This is a test run, actually, from Charles Richter's earliest days, when he developed the Richter scale. And I like the notion of the interdisciplinary character of the development of those ideas. You can see he writes, "My amateur interest in astronomy brought out the term magnitude, which is used for the brightness of a star." He and Haru Kanamori, who succeeded Richter really as the intellectual leaders of this field, also realized the connections to civil engineering and urban planning. That if you understood how waves propagate, how the Earth moves, that would be important in engineering buildings that could survive them and understanding where to place buildings. And we continue that tradition of the intersection of the basic knowledge and the applications to help rectify the injuries that come from the movement of the Earth to this very day. So here's an example of that. This is the so-called JPL's Finder. This is an instrument that's a radar instrument developed to accurately determine the distance between spacecraft. What it's used for here is detecting movement, the change your distance, say, to somebody's heart who's beating, perhaps buried under 25 feet of rubble. So this is now brought to accident emergency areas, earthquake areas, to search for survivors. Similarly, the interrogation of the Earth and understanding the Earth science that's going on leads to maps that are very useful and images that can tell us about damage. For example, this one for Hurricane Maria, which shows then which buildings are destroyed, which areas need help most quickly. Wind tunnels have been a characteristic of Caltech's contribution not only to fluid mechanics, but also to industry. So this is the original Gauss drawings for the original Gauss wind tunnel. This was built in the late 1920s. Its drive, in fact, was an old World War I submarine motor, which then could generate winds up to 200 miles per hour. In fact, there are recordings in the archives of a time in the 60s when the propellers broke and in fact were detected in the Seismo lab next door. So you can just imagine the power of these things rattling down the wind tunnel. At that time, in the 30s and going into World War II, we were the place that all the aerospace companies tested their wing designs. So Douglas and Hughes and Lockheed and Boeing all brought their wing designs here to, this is a DC-3, to be tested. We continued to do some of that, but not as much in that fashion, and have moved on to designing particular mechanisms to increase efficiency of airfoils and to look at other sorts of applications in the Lucas wind tunnel.
You know what I'd like to do is maybe put something really unaerodynamic in there and show what we're talking about. Kurt, crank her up!
Don't let the way he's looking, he could almost be a Corvette out there.
At least I was more aerodynamic than that guy.
So you'll be happy to know that we've determined Jay Leno's coefficient of drag is 0.91 in the Lucas Wind Tunnel. But we use this for car design and other measurements of fluid dynamics. We also build a set of wind tunnels that are much smaller for other purposes. This is from Michael Dickinson's laboratory. And what he does is he looks at the flight of insects in this chamber, tracks them with cameras. So you'll be happy to know that a mosquito, when it is coming to sting you, to bite you, tracks you originally by your CO2, your carbon dioxide exhalation, but it will not help you to hold your breath, because when it gets closer, it then switches over to detecting the heat that you're putting out. But we can understand the various types of mechanisms that translate now into the behavior of various insects. And most recently, we dedicated the Center for Autonomous Systems and Technologies, colloquially referred to as the Dronarium. So you can think of this as a modern-day wind tunnel. It's a 3-story high edifice, enclosed, where we can fly drones and look at their behavior. And there's a 10-foot by 10-foot wall which has 1,000 fans in it, which can create all kinds of different air currents. Drones actually are not very stable right now. And you can now track them. There are 40 cameras on the walls, infrared cameras, that can determine positioning within 10 microns. So we can now understand very exactly the behavior of the drones and also the control theory that goes into having drones work together, flying in formation. If you launch something into space, how do you assemble a big telescope autonomously? How do we develop things like flying ambulances so you can rescue people without getting stuck in traffic? If you're a geologist and going on a field trip and see an interesting formation, instead of trying to climb down that cliff, how do you use a drone to tell you that what might be there, or a series of drones, or a connection of drones and robots? And so this is really the future, which is spawning and is connected to, again, a revitalized aerospace industry in Southern California. This is a picture of Los Angeles in 1948, when it was famous for its smog. The reason Los Angeles does not look like this anymore has to do a lot with the work of Ari Hagen-Smits. He was a bioinorganic chemist who was looking at the aspects of compounds that determine characteristics of those compounds. So for example, he was isolating the trace chemicals that give pineapples and red wine their taste. He used those sorts of techniques now to analyze what was going on in the air in environmental chambers, and found that nitrous oxide emissions from cars interacted with hydrocarbons in the presence of sunlight to form ozone and smog. In fact, he went on quite a campaign with this discovery to have the laws changed to protect the environment. Here's a picture of him giving a talk. He would create the smog in this chamber here, was known as Hagen smog, that he could then show the techniques by which the problem arose. And so we owe him a great debt in this fashion. And we continue on with these kinds of investigations. You could just look at the newspapers of what's going on around the world to see the real impact now of air pollution in various cities, to try to understand those different environments. And here's a picture of modern-day chamber with Rick Flaget and John Seinfeld. They actually have dual chambers next to each other with mass spectrometers hanging off the sides. You can inject in very small quantities the elements you want to interact. You can have a controlled chamber where you can not inject that, or you can inject less of it, or you can shine sunlight in one, or UV light in one and not in the other, so that they can do really well-controlled experiments to understand those kinds of interactions. Our interests expand even farther than that. These are some members of Victoria Orphans Group. They're out near Alyssa Canyon, where you had that terrible leakage of methane and ethane, 109,000 metric tons. And they're interested in the interaction between microbes and the environment. So as the atmosphere changes in the early Earth, and that's the foundation of geobiology, which was a Caltech endeavor, the microbes, of course, changed the atmosphere in the Earth, and they changed because of their interactions with the atmosphere. Here, Victoria's group is interested in understanding which microbes flourish and convert the methane to energy. And can you use that to clean up emissions and accidents of this sort? So this is a wonderful quote from Lee Hood just earlier this year when he won the NAS Award for Chemistry in Service to Society. Science must be enshrined in our hearts and our minds, for science is the key to inventing a future that has power, beauty, simplicity, and the ability to let all of us reach our potential. Lee Hood, of course, invented the DNA sequencer. So before his invention, you manually had to pipette things out and then manually sequence the DNA. In his sequencer, he automated that process, tagged the 4 bases of DNA with different fluorescent dyes, and could increase the speed a factor of 3,000. That's increased much larger, but that's what made possible the Human Genome Project. So it's the invention then of one instrument that just changes the path of science in a certain way and changes and improves society. We continue to work on aspects of DNA, not so much the sequencing, but various types of analysis. This is Barbara Wold, who's been a pioneer in understanding RNA sequences. Of course, the DNA doesn't tell you all the information. It's the proteins that are encoded in the DNA that do the work, and that's controlled by the RNA. And shown in the inset here is, over the last 8 or 9 years, the increase in the number of papers involved with RNA sequencing. And you can see that it's become a profound industry, pioneered in part by Barbara's efforts. This is Jackie Barton, who's in chemistry and chemical engineering, and she has been studying the electronic properties of DNA. Here are some DNA molecules tethered to a gold substrate, and it turns out that transcription, replication, and repair of DNA are related to the way that charges move up and down the spine of the DNA. It's like snipping a wire when you fix a bad part on it. This is a picture of Lunatic 1, the first digital mass spectrometer from Jerry Wasserberg. This is in the National Museum of American History. The lunatic does not refer to the individuals who made it, although his lab was called the Lunatic Asylum, but refers the Luna as to moon. So when isotopes, radioactive isotopes decay, they decay at a specific rate. So they're a clock. So you can tell the age of various rocks, like the moon. The problem is you have to be able to measure very accurately the relative values of the isotopes. And the digital mass spectrometer increased that capability by a factor of 30. In so doing, he was one of the first to look at the lunar rocks back from Apollo 11. They were able to date the moon at 3.5 to 3.7 billion years. And that narrow window then ruled out huge numbers of theories that had talked about the origin of the moon. And so the ability to determine something precisely can just change the way that you understand what's around you. We continue to work with mass spectrometers. It turns out the way that different isotopes clump in a material, their spatial distribution, is related to the temperature at which they're formed. And so this is John Euler's spectrometer here, where he looked at dinosaur teeth. And you could tell the temperature at which they were formed, which tells you that they were warm-blooded. So as he said, if you weigh 80 tons, your problem is not staying warm, it's trying not to burst into flames, to argue that it wasn't surprising to find out that dinosaurs are warm-blooded. Of course, you can also look at Martian samples. and try to understand, in terms of meteorites, whether the formation of those meteorites occurred in conditions like Earth's, whether there was water there, whether it was warm, or was it a cold, dry environment. There are different ways of weighing molecules as well. This is a MEMS device, a microelectronic mechanical device, which is a little micron-long oscillator where you can now weigh single cells. And this is out of Michael Ruckus's lab. It's a different way now of looking at the masses of various objects on this small scale. It's a quote from Carl Anderson, who won the Nobel Prize for inventing the cloud chamber. The technical difficulty has been compared to asking a man who has never seen a piano to describe a piano from the sound it makes falling downstairs in the dark. So this is the kind of ambition and fearlessness that we look to in our instrument makers. This is a drawing of the original cloud chamber. It holds a low pressure environment of water vapor. Looks like clouds. It's actually relatively simple. If you put an electromagnet around it, then charged particles coming through it will make tracks. And they will bend depending on their mass, and the direction they bend depends on the sign of their charge. And because of that ability, Carl Anderson was able to discover the first examples of antimatter. Same mass, a positron is the same mass as an electron, but the different opposite charge. And so it bends in the other way in the cloud chamber. Also discovered the muons from coming from outer space. Some of the regional data in terms of our understanding of how the Earth has been bombarded from outer space comes from these sorts of measurements. Carl Anderson was the thesis advisor of Donald Glaser, who also won the Nobel Prize, but for inventing the bubble chamber. Bubble chambers now have a superheated mixture of a liquid. A diethyl ether is what's used. And so then as a charged particle comes through, it forms little bubbles. And you can see with higher resolution the tracks then of the particles coming through. There's a long story actually to development of this device. Glaser was trying a number of different fluids to use. One of them was beer. It didn't work. It exploded. He was afraid that, in fact, he would be fired because the chair of the division at the time was a teetotaler. But he survived, and the industry continued. And these are tracks from a bubble chamber. It's hard to say if it's science or art. It really has its beauty in many ways. This is a detector at the Large Hadron Collider, the largest atom smasher in the world right now at CERN, called the Compact Muon Solenoid, where there are so many interactions coming out. To try to visualize them and analyze them, one needs incredible computation power, in fact, using quantum annealing and those sorts of techniques to try to get an arm around the huge amount of data that's coming out in that fashion. This is the 30th anniversary of Ahmed Zewail's invention of femtosecond spectroscopy, looking at the formation and breaking of chemical bonds on the time scale of a billionth of a second. So here you see molecules A and B meet. This is Ahmed's description of his discovery, marry and beget the species. This takes place in 1/1,000,000th of a billionth of a second. This is a fundamental process in nature, and the world was looking for a way to be able to see the process, but many brilliant people said it couldn't be done. So Ahmed had the courage of his convictions. In fact, the work was done in a beautifully resonant way in the laboratory which Linus Pauling had used for his X-ray equipment. Because Pauling, of course, talked about the structure of the chemical bond, and Zewail showed the dynamics of the chemical bond. And this led to the development of the 4D ultrafast electron microscope. The 4Ds have to do with the connection now of the 3 dimensions of space and the 1 dimension of time. And so here is a rendition of some experiments he did which showed visualized molten lead flowing through nanotubes of zinc oxide. So one could actually track the movement as they went through in very small time scales. So a hugely powerful approach. And we see these days a revolution actually in microscopy and the ability of various types of microscopes, numerous of which have connections to Caltech. So development of new types of optical microscopes. Eric Betsick won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for the development of a way to image biological specimens by tagging them with fluorescent molecules and taking pictures and then putting them all together. This is known as PALM. And here's a picture. You can see the molecular scaffolding of a cell imaged under PALM. This is what you'd see under a light microscope. So you can see the kind of resolution and information you can get out. Cryo-electron microscopy is a new way that you flash freeze a biological sample and now can take pictures just like you would in an X-ray source, except you can look at really big floppy molecules that are frozen in place. And photoacoustic spectroscopy is under development now. We just hired one of the creators of this, Li-Hong Wang. And the idea is that you can go beneath the skin with light, intersect with an organ, and generate sound waves in that organ where you couldn't put an ultrasound apparatus on it, a transducer on it. So this is an image now of movement of oxygen through the veins in the brain of a mouse. So you can see the kind of imaging that you can get that way. Carver-Mead is classic Caltech. So let me read you this quote. Moore's law is really a thing about human activity. It's about vision. It's about what you're allowed to believe. Because people are really limited by their beliefs. They limit themselves by what they allow themselves to believe about what is possible. This is the cultural ethos that I started talking about that makes Caltech special. He, of course, was very famous, along with Lynn Conway of development of VLSI, and wrote the standard text on that. We continue in our work on trying to go beyond Moore's law through a variety of techniques, most famous of those being quantum computing. This is a picture of Dave Shea. I think it captures well the excitement of being and danger of being an experimentalist. Dave works on nonlinear optical measurements of quantum systems to try to understand a particular type of order that could be exploited in developing the hardware for quantum computations. And we work very hard in this on the software end as well, and the theoretical framework of this. These are notes from a student who went to Alexei Kitaev's first talk here at Caltech. Kitaev has developed the notions of topologically protected quantum states. That is particularly robust quantum states that might be used for computing that aren't going to be disturbed by imperfections in the material or changes in the environment. Because as you know, quantum mechanics is very sensitive to those sorts of interactions with the environment. So those ideas may very well be at the foundation of next generation quantum computation. So how do we keep Caltech special? We need to continue to be driven by this culture of fearlessness. We need to develop revolutionary instrumentation and generate the philanthropic investments that make this possible. My dream, in fact, is to create a fund here that will inspire and allow people to take these ideas, these risky ideas of how you can look at a problem in a different way and set the field in a new direction by developing a particular type of instrument in the broadest sense. This is a competitive advantage for Caltech. It's been preferentially recognized by our many Nobel Prizes throughout the history of the Institute. It's important to note that every time you make a discovery, if you think of the cloud chamber going to the bubble chamber, one needs a better instrument to get to the next step. You need LIGO, you need advanced LIGO. And sometimes those are evolutionary steps, but sometimes they're revolutionary steps. The kind of palm approach to microscopy was not a simple extension of just getting better resolution and optical measurement. Instruments more and more from one field can transform another. That is, we find that people who are exposed to an environment where the different disciplines interact take insights on how they measure something in one arena and bring it to another arena. We see this most profoundly these days in the intersection of the physical sciences and a lot of the techniques there into the biological sciences. And the returns are profound. This is why we do it. We do it because we need to create knowledge for humanity for all time, and also because we need to improve the human condition today. Thank you.